Okay, well, welcome.
They're not complaining.
Welcome to the old Presbyterian. Oh, y'all can come on down.
Yeah, that's what I told them. They don't want me stepping on the graves. Already, yeah.
Well, welcome everybody. This is the old Presbyterian Meeting House graveyard. This church, first of all, we'll start here, was built in 1774. Oh, and just to let you all know, when you all were laughing about how it's still light out, I didn't tell you that my last story takes an hour, so by the time I'm done, it will be dark when I run off. I'm just kidding. Anyway, so there's the church there. It was built in 1774. It's not the oldest church in town. But when it was built, this is the way of the outskirts of the town. Remember, John Carlisle, he's way over there. And so here's the churchyard right here, and they started burying bodies here in colonial times. Now, the church has a history in itself, interesting history. It's where George Washington had his funeral. Now, of course, George is buried at Mount Vernon. He wasn't a member of this church, but this was the only church that would have been big enough to be able to hold the crowds that are, of course, going to come see George's funeral. Now, if you look around in the graveyard, though, there's a couple people here that you all have already met. John Carlisle is way over there on that one that looks like a tabletop, and it's actually called a tabletop grave because it looks like a table. And you remember the guy who had the house with the basement had the well in it? Mm-hmm. Well, he's right over here in that crypt right there. That's where he lived, or where he died, I mean. And so, of course, if you look around, it's not a very big graveyard. So, I mean, how many bodies do you think are buried in this graveyard?
Like 25.
Yeah, there's about 25, maybe 50, or 350. The reason there's so many bodies in here and not a lot of headstones is, first of all, in colonial times, unless you were somebody very rich, you wouldn't have gotten a headstone. You didn't get a coffin. They dug a hole. If you were lucky, somebody gave you a sheet, wrap you in a sheet. They bury you. 50, 60 years later, of course, they need space. They're running out of space. Lots of people are dying. Remember, you're all dumping chamber pots in the street. How clean can this town be? And so they would dig a hole, dig you back up. Of course, you're nothing but bones at that point, and they would just move all your bones to the side and bury another body down there. I mean, you're willing to share your grave, right? You're not using it anymore. So, of course, that's why there's a lot of bodies in here, not a lot of graves. Another reason is whole families, of course, are dying from diseases in these days. You know, smallpox, yellow fever, scarlet fever. So if mom and dad and 4 or 5 kids die, they're not going to dig 6 holes for everybody. They'll dig one deep hole, lay all the bodies on top of each other, and bury everybody together. That saves space and time and money. Finally, the last thing is, we're back to the Civil War. We made our full circle here tonight. When the Union Army takes over the town, they fortify it so the Confederates can't take the town back. Well, their cannon keep having trouble sinking in the mud. Cannons are heavy. And so somebody came up with the idea, let's go to a graveyard and dig up old headstones. We'll lie the headstones in the forts, put our cannons up on the headstones. That'll keep the cannons steady. And of course, after 4 years of war, I guarantee you, no Union soldier cared who John Smith of Alexandria graveyard was. They just threw all the headstones away, and so they got busted up and became concrete and streets or who knows what. But why we know there's this many bodies in here and why you say it don't matter where you walk is because the church has kept all the records of all the burials. So we know all the bodies that are buried here and the dates they were buried. Now, our most famous guy in the graveyard, though, is this guy in the corner here, and this is the tomb of an unknown Revolutionary War soldier. There's only 2 in the country dedicated to him. One's here, one's up in Philadelphia at Independence Hall. Now, this guy here, St. Mary's Catholic Church, is just standing right there. We're doing some expansion. When they bumped into a box they thought was full of rifles from the war, and when they opened up the box, there were no rifles in it. There was a skeleton with a uniform on. Of course, they didn't wear dog tags back then. Nobody knows who he was, where he's from. They do think he's from Kentucky, though, because his buttons had Kentucky symbol on them. Kentucky was part of Virginia in the Revolution, so they think he was fighting in Virginia, maybe died at Yorktown the last battle. Well, they made the nice little tomb for him, and we decorated it holidays and everything, and there's a light on all the time for him. But ever since they made him into this nice little tomb, he doesn't seem to like to stay in his nice little tomb. And he loves to show up in that round window right there. And I've seen him in 3 different ways that he shows up in that window. He shows up on people's cameras, and the way he shows up is sometimes he'll show up as a regular skeleton face. Sometimes he shows up has a white face with no hair, and where his eyes are just two big black holes. And then the other couple months ago, he showed up in his uniform. I'm so far the only tour guide who's actually seen him in his uniform on a camera. He showed up, he was on the right-hand side of the glass, and he was from his chest up, and he was wearing a sash, and he was wearing a tricorn hat, and he was wearing shoulder epaulets, so we know he was some sort of officer, and that's why he was buried in that rifle box and not just buried in the ground. So you all take pictures of that window, take as much time as you want, maybe you'll see him. Some people will actually take 3 or 4 shots in a row. The first shot, nothing. Second shot, nothing. The third shot, he shows up, and the fourth shot, nothing again. So it's up to you if you get something. I can't guarantee it. I'm only guaranteeing the bad jokes tonight. Now, I wanted to tell you one last story before I run off. And this story hits close to home. Remember I told you all about the house I owned in Cleveland? Well, if any of you own houses, you know that when you buy a house, you have to sign your name 350 times. And so after I signed my name 350 times, the real estate agent says to me as she starts her car and pulls down the driveway, oh, by the way, the kids of the family previous used to see something in their bedroom all the time. And then she drove off very fast, and I never heard from her again. And so it took a couple months until something started happening. And the first thing that happened was I was sitting on the couch, and all of a sudden I look up, and standing in the doorway was a woman. And this woman was all in black, and I could tell she was a woman because she had a figure and hips, you know, everything. But she was very flowy, like in a dress. She had no feet. She was like hovering off the floor, and where her face was all distorted. And she was, you know, hovering there, and then she started up the stairs. And I had the kind of house where you would go up the stairs to a landing, then you would turn and go up the rest of the way to the second floor. And she went up to the landing, she turned, looked back at me, and then went the rest of the way up the stairs. I thought, wow, that's really weird. And guess where I slept that night?
On the couch?
Yeah, on the couch downstairs, yes. And a few weeks later, I was having a barbecue, and we had a bunch of people over, and a friend of mine needed to use the bathroom, so I tell him it's upstairs. He goes upstairs, and he's back downstairs within 1 second, and goes, I don't have to use the bathroom anymore. And I asked him what happened, and he said, well, he went upstairs, and he heard a little girl laugh, and he thought it was some kid from the party. He looks, and he said, but this girl was dressed in an old dress. She ran down the hallway and then disappeared into the wall. And he went, well, I figured I don't have to go to the bathroom that bad anymore. Well, after both instances, I started doing research on the property to see what was going on. And I ended up finding out that in 1919, there was a streetcar accident in Cleveland where a streetcar had flipped over and it had crushed a bunch of people that were on the streetcar. And a mother and a daughter were crushed on that streetcar, and guess where they lived? Your house. Your house. And so from then on, I lived in the house for 3 years before I moved here 2 years ago. And from then on, things would happen all the time in the house. It would be, I'd be taking a shower, and all of a sudden I'd finish, move the curtain, and the woman would go gliding by the door. Or I'd be sleeping at night, and I'd hear a little girl giggling, and I would wake up to a girl pulling the covers off of my bed, and then she would take off running when she saw me and disappear. Or I'd be downstairs watching TV, and I'd hear footsteps upstairs, like somebody running back and forth, and I would hear giggling and laughing and talking upstairs, like a little girl playing. And so it was just something I lived with for the whole time and never felt threatened or anything, so it was kind of interesting. So I don't know if any of you ever believe in ghosts or you ever saw a ghost or had an experience, but I'm just here to tell you all the ghost stories I told you tonight actually happened to me, all the orbs and everything I told you about, and with the story of the house with living with the woman and the daughter. So I hope you all enjoyed the tour tonight. I will give you directions, and I'll hang around if you all have any great comments about ghost things or you want to talk about anything. But when you're ready to leave, you can go down the pathway, make a left, and go 2 blocks. You'll be back at the visitor center. Or I suggest going this way, because you'll see a different street in town. And especially the first street you cross, wait till you see this house on the corner. It's scarier than anything else I showed you tonight. It's on the tour route, but every night when I go by that house, it gives me the heebie-jeebies. So if you all want to see that creepy house, go down there, make a right, and you'll go 2 blocks back to the visitor center too. So y'all have a good night, be safe, whatever you're doing tonight. Thanks for coming on the tour.
Thank you.
Thank you.